Be me. 26-year-old Femanon, work as a social worker, literally get paid to fix broken people, or at least try to. Have this savior complex according to my therapist, but whatever. My friends always joke about it at wine night. Best friend Sarah brings it up every single time. We're at her apartment and she's pouring the third glass. Tells me, your problem is you think everyone can be saved. I roll my eyes and say that's literally my job. She laughs and says, no, I mean, in your personal life, you always date projects. My other friend Monica chimes in and agrees, starts listing my exes like she's reading a case file, mentions the unemployed musician, the guy with anger issues, the one who lived with his parents at 30. I defend myself and say I just see potential in people. Sarah leans back and grins at me with that look. The look that means she's about to say something stupid. She goes, I bet you couldn't fix a real lost cause, though. I ask what she means by real lost cause. Monica jumps in and says, like a proper NEET, someone who's completely given up. I tell them that's actually sad and not something to joke about. Sarah waves her hand dismissively and says, no, but seriously, I bet you couldn't do it. Now I'm interested because I don't like being told I can't do something. Ask what exactly she's proposing. She sits up and gets this mischievous look. Says, my boyfriend's roommate, total shut-in, hasn't left the apartment in months, plays video games all day. I've heard about this guy before in passing. Sarah's boyfriend Mark complains about him not paying rent on time. I ask what the bet is. Sarah grins and says, you get him out of the apartment, socializing, maybe even on a date with someone, and I'll pay for our next girls' trip. Monica gasps and says, wait, are we talking about the Hawaii trip? Sarah nods and says, full payment, flights, hotel, everything. I'm skeptical and ask what I get if I lose. She thinks for a moment and says, you have to admit that not everyone can be fixed and stop dating projects for at least a year. Monica is already laughing. I consider it because free Hawaii sounds amazing. Also because I'm competitive and hate losing bets. Tell them fine, but I need access to talk to him regularly. Sarah says Mark can probably arrange something. We shake on it, and I'm already planning my approach. Next week, Sarah texts me saying Mark talked to his roommate. Apparently his name is Tyler, and he agreed to let me visit. Probably didn't tell him why I'm really coming over. I show up at their apartment on Saturday afternoon. Mark opens the door and looks relieved to see me. He's a decent guy, works in finance, always stressed about something. He whispers, thank God you're here, maybe you can actually help. I ask where Tyler is. Mark points to a closed door at the end of the hall, tells me good luck. He's been in there since yesterday morning. I walk down and knock on the door, hear a muffled what from inside. Say hi, I'm Emma, Sarah's friend, can I come in? Silence for a moment, then he says, why? I'm not sure what to say, so I improvise. Tell him I'm doing research on gaming culture for work. He's quiet again, then says, the door is unlocked. I open it and immediately hit with the smell of stale air and energy drinks. His room is dark except for 3 monitors glowing. He's sitting in a gaming chair, doesn't even turn around. I can see empty takeout containers stacked on a desk. He says, research, huh? What do you want to know? I step inside and close the door behind me. Tell him I'm interested in how gaming affects social structures. He finally turns around and looks at me. He's actually not bad looking under the messy hair and tired eyes. Looks like he hasn't slept properly in days. He raises an eyebrow and says, sounds like bullshit, but okay. I'm caught off guard by his directness. Decide to switch tactics and just be honest. Tell him, okay, fine. My friend thinks I can't help someone like him get back into normal life. He actually laughs at that. Says, someone like me, you mean a loser who plays games all day? I shake my head and say, no, I mean someone who's struggling. He leans back in his chair and studies me. Asks, and what do you get out of this? I admit there's a bet involved and I'm competitive. He seems amused and says, at least you're honest about it. Asks what happens if he says no. I shrug and tell him, then I lose the bet and life goes on. He spins back to his monitors and says, all right, I'll play along. Might be entertaining. I'm surprised it was that easy. Ask if I can come back next week. He says, sure, whatever, without looking at me. I leave and text Sarah that first contact was successful. She responds with, this is going to be harder than you think. Next Saturday, I come back with coffee and bagels. Mark lets me in and says Tyler actually asked if I was coming. I take that as a good sign. Knock on the door and he tells me to come in. This time he's turned around waiting for me. I hand him a coffee and he looks surprised. He says, you brought me coffee? I tell him I brought myself coffee and got him one too. He takes it and actually smiles a little. Says, black, no sugar, how did you know? I admit I guessed based on the energy drink cans. He nods and says, good guess. We sit in silence for a moment while he drinks. I break it by asking what game he's playing. He tells me it's some competitive shooter I've never heard of, starts explaining the mechanics and meta strategies. I'm honestly lost, but I nod along. He stops mid-sentence and says, you have no idea what I'm talking about. I laugh and admit I don't. He seems to appreciate the honesty. Tells me most people just pretend to understand. I ask if he can show me instead of explain. He looks uncertain but hands me a controller. Spends the next hour teaching me basic controls. I'm terrible, but he's patient about it. At one point I get a kill and actually celebrate. He's laughing at my reaction. Says, you're acting like you won a championship. I tell him small victories matter. He goes quiet at that and he says, yeah, I guess they do. When I'm about to leave, I ask if he's eaten today. He gestures at an empty ramen cup. I make a face and say that doesn't count as real food. He shrugs and says it's food. I tell him next time I'll bring real lunch. He doesn't argue, which I take as permission. Third week I show up with sandwiches from a good deli. Mark is surprised and says, you're really committed to this. I tell him someone has to be. Tyler's door is already open when I get there. He's sitting on his bed instead of the gaming chair. I notice he's cleaned up a bit, the trash is gone. I comment on it and he looks embarrassed. Says, figured if you're going to keep coming, I should make it less disgusting. I smile and hand him a sandwich. We eat and talk about random stuff. He tells me he used to work in software development. Got burned out after a toxic workplace and just stopped trying. I ask when that was. He thinks and says, about 8 months ago. I'm careful not to sound judgmental when I ask what he does all day. He laughs bitterly and says, this, just this, wake up, game, sleep, repeat. Asks if I think that's pathetic. I tell him I think it's a coping mechanism. He looks surprised and says, that's the first time someone's called it that instead of lazy. I explain that depression and burnout can look like laziness from outside. He's quiet for a long time. Finally says, you talk like my therapist used to. I ask if he still sees them. He shakes his head and says he stopped going months ago. I don't push it, but I make a mental note. Before I leave, I ask if he wants to maybe sit in the living room next time. He tenses up and says, why? I tell him just for a change of scenery. He says he'll think about it. Week 4 and Mark texts me before I arrive. Says, I don't know what you're doing, but Tyler came out for dinner last night. I'm genuinely happy to hear that. When I arrive, Tyler is actually in the living room. Sitting on the couch, looking uncomfortable, but he's there. Mark excuses himself to give us space. I sit down and ask how it feels being out of the room. He says, weird, like I forgot how big the apartment is. We talk, and I notice he's more engaged today. Makes eye contact more, laughs at jokes. I ask if he's thought about maybe going outside. He immediately closes off and says, that's different. I don't push and change the subject. Bring up a movie I watched recently. He says he's heard of it but hasn't seen it. I jokingly say we should watch it together sometime. He looks at me like I'm crazy. Says, are you asking me on a date? I'm flustered and say, no, I just meant like hanging out. He smirks and says, sure, hanging out. I can feel my face getting red. He's clearly enjoying making me uncomfortable. Says, you know you're pretty bad at this whole fixing people thing. I ask what he means. He leans back and says, you're supposed to stay detached, professional, but you actually care. I tell him that's not a bad thing. He shrugs and says, maybe not, just means you'll get hurt when this doesn't work. I ask why he thinks it won't work. He says, because people like me don't just get better. We are what we are. I shake my head and tell him that's not true. He doesn't argue, but I can tell he doesn't believe me. When I'm leaving, he says, hey, Emma. I turn around. He says, thanks for trying anyway. I tell him I'm not trying. I'm succeeding. He just can't see it yet. Week 5, I show up, and Sarah texts me asking for an update. Tell her he's made progress, but not enough for the bet yet. She sends back, TikTok, you've got 2 months left. I forgot we put a 3-month time limit on this. Mark lets me in and whispers he showered today without me asking. I give him a thumbs up. Tyler's in the living room again, this time looking less uncomfortable. I sit down and notice he's wearing clean clothes. I compliment him, and he looks embarrassed. Says, don't make it weird. I laugh and promise I won't. We're talking about video games when he suddenly says, I've been thinking about what you said. I ask which part. He says about coping mechanisms in depression. Tells me he looked up his old therapist's contact info. I try to stay calm, but inside I'm celebrating. I ask if he's going to reach out. He says, maybe, I don't know, feels like admitting defeat. I tell him it's the opposite of defeat. He considers this and nods slowly, says, "You're weird. You know that?" I ask what he means. He says, "You barely know me, but you're here every week acting like you care." I tell him I do care. He looks uncomfortable and changes the subject, asks if I want to play that game again. I agree, and we spend the next hour gaming. I'm better this time, and he notices. Says, "Have you been practicing?" I admit I downloaded it and played a few times during the week. He seems genuinely touched by that. Says, "You practiced a game you don't even like just to play with me?" I tell him I wanted to keep up. He's quiet for a moment, then says, "You're really serious about this bet?" I tell him it stopped being about the bet a while ago. He looks at me with this expression I can't read. Week 6. Monica texts me asking how Project NEET is going. I tell her I hate that she calls him that. She says sorry but wants to know if I'm winning. I tell her progress is happening but slow. She says, Sarah's already booking the Hawaii trip, right? I tell her to have some faith. When I arrive, Tyler is actually waiting by the door. Mark sees my face and grins. Tyler says, "Thought we could go outside today." I'm shocked and try not to show it. Ask where he wants to go. He shrugs and says, "I don't know, you pick." I suggest the coffee shop down the street. He looks nervous but agrees. We walk there in silence. I can tell he's uncomfortable with all the people around. Keeps his head down and hands in his pockets. We get to the coffee shop and order. Sit at a corner table away from the crowd. He says, "This is harder than I thought it would be." I tell him we can leave if he wants. He shakes his head and says, "No, I need to do this." We sit there for an hour just talking. He tells me more about his old job, how the crunch time and pressure broke him, how he started having panic attacks at his desk, how he just stopped showing up one day and never went back. I listen without interrupting. When he's done, he looks exhausted, says, "Sorry, that was probably too much information." I tell him it's not, and I'm glad he told me. He manages a small smile, says, "You're easy to talk to." I take that as a big compliment coming from him. When we walk back, he seems lighter somehow. Tells me that wasn't as terrible as I expected. I laugh and say high praise. He bumps my shoulder playfully. Says, "Don't let it go to your head." Week 7, Sarah corners me at work. She literally shows up at my office unannounced. Demands to know what's happening with the bet. I tell her he went outside with me. She narrows her eyes and says, "Like a date?" I quickly say no, just as friends. She doesn't look convinced. Asks, "Are you catching feelings for Project Guy?" I deny it, but I can feel my face heating up. She gasps and says, "Oh my God, you are." I tell her to shut up. She's grinning now and says, "This is perfect. Get him to date you, and you win the bet." I tell her that's not how this works. She disagrees and says, "Sure it is. The bet was get him on a date, doesn't specify with who." I kick her out of my office, but her words are stuck in my head now. When I visit Tyler that week, he's in the living room with Mark. They're actually watching a game together. Mark sees me and makes an excuse to leave. Tyler rolls his eyes and says he's not subtle. I sit down and ask what they're watching. He explains the game and I pretend to understand. He calls me out immediately. Says, "You're doing that thing where you nod but have no idea what I'm saying." I laugh and admit he's right. He says, "You don't have to pretend with me." I tell him I know, but I want to understand things he likes. He looks at me for a long moment. Says, "Why do you care so much?" I'm honest and tell him I'm not sure anymore. Started as a bet, but now I just want to see him happy. He's quiet, then says, "What if I told you I'm starting to look forward to Saturdays?" My heart does this stupid flutter thing. I try to play it cool and say because of the free food. He smiles and says, "Sure, the food." We both know that's not what he means. Week 8, Mark pulls me aside before I can knock. Tells me Tyler got a call back for a job interview. I'm excited and ask when. He says next week, and Emma, he said you inspired him to send out his resume. I don't know what to say to that. Mark continues, "I don't know what you're doing, but it's working. He's becoming himself again." I go inside and Tyler is pacing. In his room. He sees me and says, "Mark told you, didn't he?" I nod and congratulate him. He runs his hand through his hair nervously. Says, "I'm terrified. What if I fuck it up?" I tell him he won't. He says, "You don't know that." I tell him no, but I believe in him. He stops pacing and looks at me. Says, "You really mean that?" I tell him of course I do. He takes a step closer and says, "Emma, can I ask you something?" I say, "Sure." He says, "Is this still about the bet?" I'm caught off guard by the question. I tell him honestly that I forgot about the bet weeks ago. He says, "Good, because I need to know if you're here because you want to be or because you feel obligated." I tell him I'm here because I want to be. He smiles and says, "Okay, good." There's this moment where we're just looking at each other. He says, "I think I'm going to mess this up." I ask what he means. He says, "This, us, whatever this is." I tell him there's no way to mess up friendship. He laughs and says, "Friendship, right?" I'm about to ask what he means, but he changes the subject. Week 9, I get a text from Tyler on a Thursday. He never texts me except to confirm Saturdays. The text says, "Interview is tomorrow," freaking out. I call him instead of texting back. He answers on the first ring. I ask if he's okay. He says, "No, I'm panicking. What if I can't do this?" I spend 20 minutes talking him down. Remind him of all the progress he's made. He's quiet, then says, "Will you come over after, regardless of how it goes?" I tell him, of course. He says, okay, I can do this." Friday afternoon, he texts me, "It's done. Nothing else, just that." I rush over after work. Mark opens the door and says, he's been in his room since he got back. I knock and hear "Come in." Tyler is sitting on his bed looking exhausted. I ask how it went. He says, "I think I actually did okay." I'm so proud and tell him that. He smiles and says, "I couldn't have done it without you pushing me." I tell him he did this himself. He shakes his head and says, "No, you showed up every week, even when I was a dick about it." I laugh and say he wasn't that bad. He says, "I was terrible, and you know it." We sit in comfortable silence for a moment. He says, "Emma, I need to tell you something." I'm nervous and ask what. He says, "I know about the bet Mark told me weeks ago." My stomach drops. I start to explain, but he holds up his hand, says, "I'm not mad. Actually, I think it's funny." I ask what's funny about it. He says, "You made a bet that you could fix me, but ended up just being a good friend instead." Tells me, "And the thing is, having someone just show up and care, that fixed more than any strategy would have." I don't know what to say. He continues, "So thank you for the bet, for staying, for everything." I tell him I should thank him for letting me in. He smiles and says, "So what happens now? Do you win the bet?" I tell him I don't care about the bet anymore. He says, "You should. I hear Hawaii is nice this time of year." I laugh and say maybe. He looks nervous and says, "Or maybe instead of going to Hawaii with your friends, you could get dinner with me." I ask if he's asking me on a date. He says, "Yeah, I think I am. Is that okay?" I tell him it's more than okay. He grins and says, "Good, because I've been wanting to ask for weeks." I text Sarah later that night. Tell her I'm taking her up on the bet, technically. She asks what happened. I tell her Tyler asked me on a date. She responds, "I knew it. You totally fell for Project Guy." I tell her his name is Tyler. She says, yeah. So do I still have to pay for Hawaii? I tell her yes, because a bet is a bet. She sends back, "Worth it. You're clearly happy." Monica joins the chat and says, "Wait, what did I miss?" Sarah fills her in, and Monica responds, "OMG, our friend is dating a reformed NEET." I tell them both to shut up, but I'm smiling while I type it. 2 weeks later, Tyler gets the job offer. He accepts and starts the following month. We go out to celebrate at a nice restaurant. He's nervous about being around so many people, but pushes through. Tells me 6 months ago I couldn't imagine doing this. I tell him I'm proud of him. He reaches across the table and takes my hand. Says, "I'm proud of me too." We end up officially dating after that. Sarah and Monica meet him at a group dinner. They grill him with questions. He handles it well, even laughs at their jokes. After they leave, Sarah texts me, "Okay, I approve. He's actually great." Monica adds, "And way hotter than I expected." I tell them both they're ridiculous. Tyler asks what they said. I show him the texts. He laughs and says, "Hotter than expected. Should I be offended?" I tell him probably. He kisses me and says, "I'll take it." Months pass and he's thriving at his new job. Still has hard days, but he talks about them now. Started seeing his therapist again regularly. We spend most weekends together, sometimes gaming, sometimes going out, sometimes just existing in the same space. Mark texts me one day saying, "You know you saved his life, right?" I tell him Tyler saved himself. He responds, "Maybe, but you gave him a reason to try." I screenshot it and send it to Tyler. He calls me immediately, says Mark is being dramatic. I ask if it's true though. He's quiet, then he says, "Yeah, probably. You gave me something to work towards." I'm crying now and he can hear it. He says, "Don't cry. Happy endings are supposed to be happy." I laugh through the tears, tell him I love him. He says, "I love you too, even if you did make a bet about fixing me." I groan and say, I'm never going to live that down, am I? He says, absolutely not. I'm telling our kids about this someday. I ask, our kids? He says, too soon? I tell him not too soon, just right. Sarah finally books the Hawaii trip 6 months later, insists we need to celebrate her matchmaking skills. I remind her it was a bet, not matchmaking. She disagrees and says, I knew what I was doing. Monica backs her up. Tyler finds the whole thing hilarious. Tells them they can take credit if it makes them feel better. We're at the airport waiting to board. Tyler's holding my hand and looks relaxed. I remember the guy who couldn't leave his room. Compare him to the man next to me planning our excursions. Sarah notices me staring. Says, what are you thinking about? I tell her I'm thinking about how random life is. She says, random nothing. I engineered this whole thing. Monica and I both roll our eyes. Tyler leans over and whispers, let her have this one. I agree because honestly she kind of did. On the plane, Tyler falls asleep on my shoulder. Sarah takes a picture and sends it to the group chat. Monica responds from neat to sweet. I groan at the pun, but looking at Tyler sleeping peacefully, I realize how far he's come. How far we've come together. Started as a stupid bet about fixing someone. Ended with me finding someone who didn't need fixing. Just needed someone to believe in him. And maybe I needed someone to believe in me too. Someone who saw past the savior complex of the person underneath. That feel when you make a bet to fix someone, but they end up fixing you instead.